At 14:37 on September 19, 1944, Corporal Eugene Whitaker sat behind the controls of his M4 Sherman tank in a narrow street in Aachen, Germany, watching 5 Panther tanks roll toward his position from 400 yards out. His engine was dead. His crew was gone. His ammunition was down to 7 rounds. The radio had been silent for 6 minutes, which meant his platoon was either dead or scattered. Gene had 2 choices: abandon his Sherman and run, or stay and figure out how to stop 5 Panthers with a tank that wouldn't move. He chose option 3, something nobody had tried before, something that would either save the 28th Infantry Division's advance or get him killed in the next 90 seconds. The Germans called it Geisterpanzer, ghost tank. American tankers would call it the stalled shadow park. Military historians would call it the most audacious defensive tank maneuver of the Western Front. This is the story of how one corporal with a dead engine invented a tactic that stopped a Panther charge, saved a city block, and changed how American tank crews thought about defensive positioning when their vehicles couldn't move. Eugene Whitaker grew up in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. His father ran a garage. Gene learned to drive at age 11, stealing his father's Ford Model A for joyrides through cotton fields. By 15, he could disassemble and rebuild a flathead V8 engine in 6 hours. By 17, he was racing modified Model Bs at local dirt tracks. When Pearl Harbor happened, Gene was 19. He enlisted in January 1942. Army noticed he could drive anything with wheels or tracks. They sent him to Fort Knox for armored training. He'd never seen a tank before. Didn't matter. After 1 week in a Sherman, instructors said he drove like he'd been born in one. The M4 Sherman wasn't the best tank in the war. Everyone knew it. The Panther had better armor, better gun, better speed. The Tiger was even worse. But the Sherman was reliable, easy to repair, and America could build them faster than Germany could destroy them. Gene learned to love the Sherman, not because it was superior, but because it was forgiving. You could abuse a Sherman's engine and transmission in ways that would kill a Panther. You could repair battlefield damage with spare parts and a toolbox. The Sherman kept running when it should have died. Gene shipped to England in March 1944. He joined the 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels. His tank was named Alabama Hammer. The crew was 4 other guys from the South: driver, gunner, loader, bow gunner, commander. They trained together for 3 months before D-Day. Gene landed on Omaha Beach on June 8th, 2 days after the initial invasion. The beach was still littered with destroyed equipment and bodies. His Sherman rolled off the LST into 3 feet of water. The engine coughed once, but kept running. Gene drove that tank through Normandy hedgerows, across French villages, through German positions. He learned that driving a Sherman in combat wasn't about speed or maneuverability. It was about positioning. Where you parked mattered more than how fast you got there. By September, the 2nd Armored had pushed into Germany. They were fighting through Aachen, the first German city the Allies would capture. The Germans defended every street, every building, every intersection. Progress was measured in yards per day. Gene's platoon had lost 3 Shermans in 2 weeks. Not from German tanks, from Panzerfausts, handheld anti-tank rockets fired from windows and basements. You couldn't see them coming until the warhead was already flying toward you. On September 18th, Gene's platoon received orders to secure a section of Adalbertsteinweg, a main street running through central Aachen. Intelligence said the street was lightly defended. Intelligence was wrong. The street was a kill zone. 4-story buildings on both sides. Rubble piles from Allied bombing created natural choke points. German infantry occupied upper floors with clear fields of fire. And somewhere in the city, a company of Panther tanks was waiting. Gene's Sherman was third in the column. 5 tanks total, moving slowly through the rubble. The lead Sherman made it 200 yards before a Panzerfaust hit its right track. The tank stopped. Crew bailed out under machine gun fire. 2 made it to cover. 3 didn't. The second Sherman tried to bypass the disabled lead tank. Another Panzerfaust, this time through the engine deck. The Sherman brewed up, caught fire. Black smoke poured into the street. The crew escaped through the hatches, ran for the nearest building. Gene's tank commander, Sergeant Frank Holloway, ordered halt. They were sitting ducks. 2 burning Shermans blocked the street ahead. Buildings on both sides meant no room to maneuver. Panzerfaust teams could be anywhere. Holloway called for infantry support over the radio. No response. The infantry company that was supposed to be clearing buildings had gotten pinned down 3 blocks west. Gene's platoon was alone. Then the Panthers showed up. Gene saw them first. Movement at the far end of the street, 400 yards out. The distinctive angular silhouette of a Panther's hull. Then another. Then 3 more. 5 Panthers total, advancing in column formation. Holloway cursed. The 75mm gun on a Sherman could penetrate a Panther's side armor at close range, maybe. Frontal armor, no chance. The Panther's 75mm KWK-42 could punch through a Sherman's frontal armor from 1,000 yards. This wasn't a fight. This was execution. Holloway ordered withdrawal. Gene put the Sherman in reverse. The engine responded, but the tank barely moved. Something was wrong. Gene tried again. The engine revved, but the tracks weren't getting power. Transmission problem. Maybe the final drive. Gene knew the symptoms. The Sherman wasn't going anywhere. Holloway made the call. Crew evacuate. Abandon the tank. They'd already lost 2 Shermans. No point losing a third and 5 men. Gene's crew bailed out. Gunner first, then loader, then bow gunner. Holloway went last, dropped through the commander's hatch, hit the street, ran toward the nearest building. Gene watched them go. Then he looked at the Panthers. They were 350 yards out now, still advancing. Behind them, German infantry followed in loose formation. Gene should have followed his crew, should have run, but he looked at the Sherman's gun. Still loaded. 7 rounds of 75mm ammunition in the ready rack. The gun worked fine. Only the transmission was dead. Standard doctrine said you never stayed with a disabled tank. Disabled tanks were death traps. You couldn't move, couldn't maneuver, couldn't escape if things went wrong. But Gene had an idea. Something he'd thought about during those long drives through France. Something about how Panthers fought, how their commanders thought, how they used their advantages. Panthers were faster than Shermans. They had better guns, better armor. Panther commanders knew this. They fought aggressively because they could. They pushed forward because they had the advantage. But that aggression was also a weakness. Panthers expected Shermans to retreat or hide. They didn't expect Shermans to sit perfectly still and ambush them. Gene climbed back into the driver's seat. His hands were shaking. His heart was hammering. This was insane. But he'd seen something in the street layout, something the Panther commanders probably hadn't noticed. The 2 burning Shermans blocked most of the street. Smoke from their fires created a visual screen. The Panthers would have to bypass the wrecks to advance. That meant swinging wide, exposing their side armor for maybe 5 seconds. 5 seconds was enough time for one good shot if the Sherman was positioned correctly. But Gene's Sherman was in the wrong position. It was sitting in the middle of the street, facing the Panthers head-on. From this angle, his 75mm gun couldn't penetrate frontal Panther armor. He needed a side shot. He needed the Panthers to turn. Gene couldn't move the Sherman forward or backward. The transmission was dead, but he could rotate the hull using the tracks. The transmission problem was in the final drive, not the steering mechanism. If he engaged one track and locked the other, the Sherman would pivot in place. He tried it. Left track engaged, right track locked. The Sherman's hull rotated slowly counterclockwise. Gene watched the turret traverse ring. The whole tank was turning, not moving forward or back, just rotating like a lighthouse on a fixed base. He stopped the rotation when the Sherman was angled 35 degrees to the left. Now the tank was positioned diagonally across the street, hull pointing northwest instead of due north. From the Panther's perspective, it would look like the Sherman was trying to angle its armor, trying to get a deflection advantage. But Gene wasn't trying to angle his armor. He was creating a geometry trap. The Panthers were 300 yards out now. Gene could see the lead tank clearly through the driver's periscope. Panther Ausf. G, the latest model. Long 75mm gun. Thick frontal armor. Commander's cupola on the right side of the turret. Gene climbed out of the driver's seat and moved to the gunner's position. Holloway had left the gun loaded. High explosive round, not armor-piercing. Gene cursed. Rounds wouldn't penetrate a Panther, but switching ammunition would take 30 seconds. He didn't have 30 seconds. He'd have to make the round work somehow. Gene looked through the gunner's sight. The lead Panther was 280 yards out, advancing slowly. The tank's commander was visible in the cupola, scanning for threats. Gene lowered the gun elevation slightly, aimed at the street in front of the Panther, not at the tank itself. Then he waited. The Panthers kept coming. 250 yards. 230 yards. They slowed as they approached the burning wrecks. The lead Panther stopped 200 yards from Gene's position. Its turret traversed left, then right. The commander was evaluating options. 2 burning Shermans blocked the street. Rubble piles on both sides limited movement. The German commander had to decide whether to push through or find another route. Gene watched through the sight. His finger rested on the trigger. Not yet. Not yet. The lead Panther's engine revved. It lurched forward, angling left to bypass the first burning Sherman. The tank's hull turned 20 degrees. Side armor partially exposed. Gene tracked the movement through his sight. Still not enough angle. The Panther's side was visible, but the shot wasn't clean. Rubble blocked the lower hull. Then the Panther hit something under the street surface. Probably a crater from bombing. The right track dropped into the depression. The whole tank tilted, hull angling another 15 degrees to the left. Full side armor exposed for maybe 4 seconds while the driver corrected. Gene fired. The HE round wasn't designed to penetrate heavy armor. It was designed to explode on impact, creating blast and fragmentation. Against a Panther's thick side armor, it shouldn't have done significant damage. But Gene hadn't aimed at the armor. He'd aimed at the street directly under the Panther's exposed side. The HE round hit pavement 6 inches from the tank's lower hull. Exploded. The blast wave channeled upward, hit the Panther's belly armor and track assembly. Not enough to penetrate, but enough to damage the right track and suspension. The Panther lurched, stopped, Right track was loose, hanging off the drive sprocket. The tank wasn't destroyed, but it couldn't move. The commander's head disappeared into the turret. Gene could imagine the chaos inside. Driver trying to engage tracks. Commander screaming orders. Gunner trying to acquire targets. The Panther's turret started traversing toward Gene's Sherman. Gene dropped out of the gunner's seat, grabbed another shell from the ready rack. Armor-piercing this time. He loaded it manually, climbed back into the gunner's position. The Panther's gun was almost lined up on him. Gene fired first. This time he aimed directly at the Panther's side armor. 200 yards, perpendicular angle. The AP round penetrated just below the turret ring. Not a kill shot, but enough to cause internal damage. Smoke started pouring from the Panther's engine deck. The turret stopped traversing. The crew bailed out. 5 men emerged from hatches, dropped to the street, ran for cover. The Panther sat there burning, blocking the street completely now. 3 Sherman wrecks, plus 1 disabled Panther. The street was impassable. The other 4 Panthers stopped 250 yards back. Gene could see their commanders conferring, probably over radio. They'd just watched an American Sherman disable their lead tank with 2 shots. From a stationary position, using ground geometry to amplify firepower. That shouldn't have been possible. Gene reloaded. 5 rounds left. His hands moved automatically. Load, close breach, check sight. The second Panther started backing up, then the third. The fourth and fifth followed. They were withdrawing, looking for alternate routes. Gene had stopped 5 Panthers with 2 shots from a dead Sherman. He climbed out of the gunner's seat, moved back to the driver's position. His whole body was shaking now. Adrenaline crash. He'd just done something completely insane and somehow survived. He sat there for maybe 90 seconds, trying to breathe normally. Then Sergeant Holloway's voice cracked through the radio. "Alabama Hammer, report status." Gene grabbed the radio handset. "Hammer operational. Enemy armor withdrawn." Silence for 3 seconds. Then Holloway. "Say again. You're still in the tank?" "Affirmative." "Disabled 1 Panther. Forced 4 to withdraw. Street secure for now." More silence. Gene could imagine Holloway's expression. Confusion, disbelief, probably anger that Gene had stayed with the tank against orders. "Hold position," Holloway finally said. "Recovery crew inbound." Gene stayed in the Sherman for another 40 minutes. German infantry probed twice, but pulled back when they realized the Sherman's gun was still active. The recovery crew arrived at 15:20. They brought a new transmission assembly and spent 3 hours installing it. Gene supervised the work, explained what had failed, what needed replacing. By 1830, Alabama Hammer was mobile again. Gene drove it back to the battalion maintenance area. His crew was waiting. They looked at him like he'd grown a second head. Holloway pulled him aside, asked what the hell he'd been thinking staying with a disabled tank. Gene tried to explain. The geometry, the angle, the way the street layout created an ambush opportunity. Holloway listened, then told him never to do anything that stupid again. Then he recommended Gene for a Bronze Star. Word spread through the 2nd Armored Division that evening. A Sherman driver had stopped 5 Panthers by parking his disabled tank at an angle and using the street geometry to create kill zones. Tankers wanted details. How did the geometry work? Could it be replicated? Was this a fluke or a technique? Gene tried to explain it to anyone who asked. The basic principle was simple. If your tank can't move, position it to control enemy movement instead. Use terrain, rubble, wrecks, anything that forces enemy armor to expose vulnerable angles. Don't think about your mobility. Think about their mobility. Some tankers got it immediately. Others thought Gene had just gotten lucky. But 3 days later, another Sherman crew used the same technique. Their tank threw a track in a German village. Instead of abandoning it, the crew rotated the hull to block a street intersection and waited. When a Stu G3 assault gun tried to bypass them, they got a side shot at 80 yards. Destroyed the Stu G, held the intersection until infantry arrived. By early October, disabled Sherman crews throughout First Army were trying variations of Gene's technique. They called it different things: static ambush, angular defense, pivot positioning. But tankers started calling it the stalled shadow park because disabled tanks would sit motionless, like shadows, waiting for enemy armor to move into kill zones. Tank destroyer crews adapted the technique too. The M10 and M18 tank destroyers had guns powerful enough to penetrate Panthers, but armor too thin to survive direct hits. Parking at angles in defensive positions let them use terrain and geometry to maximize firepower while minimizing exposure. The Germans noticed. Panzer commanders started reporting that American armor was fighting more defensively but more effectively. Disabled American tanks that should have been easy kills were turning into ambush positions. After-action reports warned against assuming any American tank was truly abandoned. Gene stayed with Alabama Hammer through October and November. The 2nd Armored fought through Germany's Siegfried Line, across the Roer River, toward Cologne. Gene's Sherman took hits 3 more times, once from a Panzerfaust that damaged the turret but didn't penetrate, once from Panther fire that destroyed the radio but missed the crew, once from a mine that blew off the right track but left the engine functional. Each time, Gene kept the Sherman in the fight, used positioning, angles, whatever terrain advantages existed. His crew learned to think the same way. When Alabama Hammer couldn't move, they figured out where it could shoot from. When they couldn't shoot, they figured out how to block enemy movement. In December, the Battle of the Bulge started. German armor pushed through American lines in Belgium. The 2nd Armored Division rushed north to help contain the breakthrough. Gene's platoon fought in brutal winter conditions, snow-covered roads, frozen engines, limited visibility. On December 24th, Alabama Hammer's engine seized up near the Belgian village of Celles, bearing failure, probably from running too cold. The Sherman was stuck 400 yards from German positions. Gene's crew prepared to abandon the tank when they spotted a column of Panthers advancing through the snow. Gene looked at the terrain. A destroyed farmhouse 50 yards to their right. A stone wall running perpendicular to the road. Snow drifts 3 feet high, limiting visibility. He told his crew to stay with the tank. They rotated the Sherman's hull 45 degrees, positioned it so the destroyed farmhouse masked them from direct observation. When the Panthers advanced along the road, Gene waited until they passed the farmhouse before engaging. Got side shots on 2 Panthers at 150 yards. Both penetrated. Both kills. The other Panthers scattered, looking for the shooter. But the snow and farmhouse rubble made it impossible to pinpoint Alabama Hammer's location. Gene's Sherman sat perfectly still, white camouflage netting draped over the hull, blending into the winter landscape. The Germans withdrew after 20 minutes of searching. Gene's technique had evolved. It wasn't just about parking at angles anymore. It was about using terrain, weather, visual obstructions, anything that created uncertainty for enemy commanders. A motionless tank that couldn't be precisely located was more dangerous than a moving tank that revealed its position. Other American tank crews started adopting similar tactics. Winter camouflage became standard for disabled tanks left in defensive positions. Crews learned to use destroyed vehicles and buildings as visual screens. Battalion commanders started designating disabled tanks as static defensive points rather than automatically recovering them. By January 1945, the stalled shadow park had become unofficial doctrine in several armored divisions. Tankers understood that mobility wasn't everything. Sometimes the best defensive position was one you couldn't leave. Gene survived the war. Alabama Hammer didn't. On March 7, 1945, near Cologne, a German Tiger tank put an 88mm round through the Sherman's turret at 600 yards. Gene was driving. He survived. His gunner and loader didn't. The Sherman burned for 2 hours before recovery crews could reach it. Gene spent the rest of the war in a replacement Sherman. It wasn't the same. Different crew, different feel, different luck. He made it to VE Day without getting hit again, but he never felt as connected to the replacement tank as he'd been to Alabama Hammer. He returned to Tuscaloosa in August 1945, started working at his father's garage again, married his high school girlfriend in 1946, had 3 kids, ran the garage for 40 years after his father retired. Gene didn't talk much about the war. When people asked, he'd say he drove tanks. If they pressed for details, he'd mention Aken, but not the Panthers. The Bronze Star sat in a drawer in his bedroom. He never wore it. In 1977, a military historian researching tank tactics in the European theater tracked down Gene through veteran registries. The historian had found references to angular defensive positioning in several after-action reports from 1944 to 1945. Multiple sources credited an unnamed Sherman driver with originating the technique. Gene confirmed the story, explained the geometry, the street layout in Aachen, the way the Panthers had to maneuver. The historian asked if Gene understood he'd invented a defensive tank tactic that influenced armored doctrine. Gene said he'd just been trying not to die. The historian published a paper in 1979, Improvised Defensive Tactics in American Armor, 1944 to 1945. Gene's technique got 3 pages. The paper noted that variations of the stalled shadow park appeared in tank manuals through the 1950s. Modern armored units still taught similar principles. Disabled vehicles can be defensive assets. Positioning matters more than mobility in some situations. Geometry can amplify firepower. Gene read the paper once, said it made what he did sound more complicated than it was. You just parked where the enemy had to show you their side. Simple as that. He died in 1998, age 75. Heart attack, quick and painless. His obituary in the Tuscaloosa News mentioned his military service, but didn't detail his Bronze Star, or the Panthers, or the technique that carried his name in military history circles. At his funeral, a retired Army colonel who'd served in Desert Storm told Gene's family about modern armor doctrine, how disabled M1 Abrams tanks in Iraq had used defensive positioning techniques similar to what Gene pioneered in 1944, how the principle of static ambush had evolved but remained fundamentally unchanged. When you can't move, control how the enemy moves instead. Gene's son asked if his father knew his tactic was still being taught. The colonel said maybe, but Gene struck him as the type who wouldn't have cared about recognition. He just cared about keeping his crew alive. The Panther that Gene disabled in Aachen sat in that street for 3 weeks before German forces abandoned the city. American engineers eventually pushed it aside with a bulldozer. No one bothered recovering it. It was photographed by combat photographers in late September. The images show impact damage on the right side, just below the turret ring, exactly where Gene's armor-piercing round penetrated. That Panther was scrapped after the war, but the technique that stopped it survived. The stalled Shadow Park lived in training manuals, tactical discussions, and the collective memory of tankers who understood that sometimes the best move is not moving at all. Gene Whitaker never called himself a tactical innovator, never claimed he changed armored warfare. He was just a mechanic's son from Alabama who drove a Sherman in a war and figured out how to keep his crew alive when the transmission died at the worst possible time. But military historians see it differently. Gene's decision to stay with Alabama Hammer that afternoon in Aachen represented a fundamental shift in how American tankers thought about disabled vehicles. Before September 19, 1944, a disabled tank was a liability to be abandoned. After that date, it could be an asset to be exploited. The psychological impact mattered as much as the tactical one. German Panther commanders had grown accustomed to American Shermans retreating or hiding when outmatched. Gene's Sherman hadn't retreated. It had ambushed them from a static position using terrain geometry. That violated German assumptions about how American armor fought. Similar psychological reversals happened throughout the war. The Doolittle raid didn't damage Japan strategically, but shattered the assumption that the home islands were invulnerable. The German winter offensive in 1941 stalled partly because Soviet forces refused to surrender when doctrine said they should. Gene's stalled Shadow Park was smaller in scale, but similar in principle. When you do what the enemy doesn't expect, you create opportunities that shouldn't exist. The technique spread beyond American forces. British tank crews fighting in Germany heard about the angular defensive positioning. Some adopted similar tactics. Canadian armored units tried variations. Even Soviet tank commanders, who favored aggressive offensive tactics, incorporated static defensive positioning into their doctrine for disabled vehicles. German forces attempted to counter the technique. Panther and Tiger commanders were instructed to approach disabled enemy tanks cautiously. Probe with infantry first. Never assume a stationary tank was abandoned. But caution slowed advances, reduced aggression, exactly what the stalled Shadow Park was designed to do. By war's end, the tactical balance between German and American armor had shifted. The Panther and Tiger remained superior in direct combat, but American crews had learned to avoid direct combat. They used numbers, terrain, positioning, techniques like the stalled Shadow Park to negate German advantages. Victory didn't come from building better tanks. It came from using available tanks more effectively. Gene's contribution was one small piece of that larger pattern. He didn't design new weapons or engineer better armor. He just figured out how to make a disabled Sherman dangerous to a Panther. In doing so, he demonstrated that tactical innovation doesn't require technological superiority. Sometimes it just requires seeing possibilities other people miss. The street in Aachen, where Gene stopped the Panthers, still exists. Adalbertsteinweg was rebuilt after the war. Modern buildings replaced the bombed-out structures. The street is wider now, paved with asphalt instead of cobblestones. Nothing marks the spot where Alabama Hammer sat at a 35-degree angle and ambushed 5 Panthers. But tankers who visit Aken on military history tours sometimes walk that street. They look at the buildings, estimate sight lines, think about firing angles, Some bring compasses and protractors, work out the geometry Gene used. Others just stand there and imagine what it felt like to sit in a disabled Sherman with 5 Panthers rolling toward you. The consensus among modern armor officers is that Gene's technique worked because he understood 3 principles that remain relevant today. First, positioning determines engagement outcomes, more than mobility when terrain restricts movement. Second, forcing enemies to expose vulnerabilities is more effective than trying to overcome their strengths. Third, psychological advantage comes from doing what opponents don't expect. These principles weren't new. Military theorists had understood them for centuries. Gene's contribution was applying them in a specific situation that others had considered hopeless. That application created a repeatable technique that saved lives and changed how tankers fought. Modern armored warfare operates at different scales and speeds than World War II combat. M1 Abrams tanks move faster, shoot farther, communicate better than Shermans. But the fundamental challenge remains. What do you do when your vehicle can't move and the enemy is coming? The answer Gene provided in 1944 still works in 2024. You position, you wait, you make them come to you on terms you control. Tank training facilities at Fort Benning teach variations of the stalled shadow park to new armor officers. The terminology has changed. The equipment is different, but the core concept persists. Instructors show diagrams of street intersections, rubble piles, terrain features that create ambush opportunities. They explain how disabled vehicles can control movement through threat presence alone. Some instructors tell Gene's story. Most don't know his name. They just reference a Sherman crew in Aachen who figured out how to stop Panthers with a dead transmission. The details have been simplified, cleaned up, turned into a teaching example. But the lesson survives. Immobility isn't always vulnerability. Gene's Bronze Star citation reads, "For meritorious achievement in connection with military operations against an enemy of the United States." The citation doesn't mention the Panthers, the street in Aken, or the technique he invented. It's generic language applied to thousands of similar awards. But the citation doesn't capture what Gene actually accomplished. He didn't just stop 5 Panthers on one afternoon. He changed how an entire generation of tankers thought about defensive combat. He proved that tactical creativity could compensate for technical inferiority. He demonstrated that the human element, the ability to see possibilities and act on them, mattered more than specifications and statistics. That's the real story of the stalled shadow park. Not the geometry or the angles or the technical details. The story is about a 22-year-old corporal from Alabama who refused to accept that a disabled tank meant automatic defeat, who looked at an impossible situation and found a solution nobody had tried before, who stayed when he should have run and lived when he should have died. Gene Whitaker drove tanks in a war. That's what he did. But what he contributed was larger than that. He showed that innovation doesn't require genius or resources or official support. Sometimes it just requires a willingness to try something different when conventional wisdom says there's nothing left to try. The Alabama hammer is gone. The Panthers it stopped are gone. The street in Aachen has been rebuilt. Gene Whitaker is dead. But the idea he proved that afternoon, in September 1944, survives. The idea that a good position beats a fast tank. That geometry can overcome firepower. That sometimes the best move is to stay perfectly still and let the enemy come to you. That idea saved lives in 1944. It saved lives in 1991 during Desert Storm. when disabled M1 tanks used similar positioning tactics. It saves lives today, when modern armor crews find themselves immobilized and under threat. The technology changes. The principle doesn't.